Scottish literature is literature written in Scotland by Scottish writers. It includes works in English, Scottish Gaelic, Scots, Brythonic, French, Latin, Norn or other languages written within the modern boundaries of Scotland. The earliest extant literature written in what is now Scotland was composed in Brythonic speech in the 6th century and has survived as part of Welsh literature. In the following centuries there was literature in Latin under the influence of the Catholic Church, and in Old English, brought by Anglian settlers. As the state of Alba developed into the Kingdom of Scotland from the 8th century, there was a flourishing literary elite who regularly produced texts in both Gaelic and Latin, sharing a common literary culture with Ireland and elsewhere. After the Davidian Revolution of the 13th century, a flourishing French language culture predominated, while Norse literature was produced from areas of Scandinavian settlement. The first surviving major text in early Scots literature is the 14th century poet John Barbers' epic Bruce, which was followed by a series of vernacular versions of medieval romances. These were joined in the 15th century by Scots prose works. In the early modern era, royal patronage supported poetry, prose and drama. James V's court saw works such as Sir David Lindsay of the Mounts, the Three Estates. In the late 16th century, James VI became patron and member of a circle of Scottish court poets and musicians known as the Castilian Band. When he acceded to the English throne in 1603, many followed him to the new court. But without a centre of royal patronage, the tradition of Scots poetry subsided. It was revived after union with England in 1707 by figures including Allan Ramsay and James Macpherson. The latter's Ossian cycle made him the first Scottish poet to gain an international reputation. He helped inspire Robert Burns, considered by many to be the national poet, and Walter Scott, whose Waverley novels did much to define Scottish identity in the 19th century. Towards the end of the Victorian era, a number of Scottish-born authors achieved international reputations, including Robert Louis Stevenson, Arthur Conan Doyle, J. M. Barrie and George MacDonald. In the 20th century, there was a surge of activity in Scottish literature, known as the Scottish Renaissance. The leading figure, Hugh MacDiarmid, attempted to revive the Scots language as a medium for serious literature. Members of the movement were followed by a new generation of post-war poets, including Edwin Morgan, who would be appointed the first Scotsmaker by the inaugural Scottish government in 2004. For the 1980s, Scottish literature enjoyed another major revival, particularly associated with writers including James Kelman and Irvine Welsh. Scottish poets who emerged in the same period included Carol Ann Duffy, who was named as the first Scot to be UK Poet Laureate in May 2009. Middle Ages. Early Middle Ages. After the collapse of Roman authority in the early 5th century, four major circles of political and cultural influence emerged in northern Britain. In the east were the Picts, whose kingdoms eventually stretched from the River Forth to Shetland. In the west were the Gaelic-speaking people of Dalriata, who had close links with Ireland, from where they brought with them the name Scots. In the south were the British descendants of the peoples of the Roman-influenced kingdoms of the Old North, the most powerful and longest surviving of which was the Kingdom of Strathclyde. Finally, there were the English or Angles, Germanic invaders who had overrun much of southern Britain and held the Kingdom of Bernicia, which reached into what are now the borders of Scotland in the southeast. To these, Christianization, particularly from the 6th century, added Latin as an intellectual and written language. Modern scholarship based on surviving place names and historical evidence indicates that the Picts spoke a Brythonic Brythonic language, but none of their literature seems to have survived into the modern era. However, there is surviving literature from what would become Scotland in Brythonic, Gaelic, Latin and Old English. Much of the earliest Welsh literature was actually composed in or near the country we now call Scotland, in the Brythonic speech, from which Welsh would be derived, which was not then confined to Wales and Cornwall, although it was only written down in Wales much later. These include the Gododin, considered the earliest surviving verse from Scotland, which is attributed to the bard Ninian, said to have been resident in Brythonic kingdom of Gododin in the 6th century. It is a series of elegies to the men of the Gododin killed fighting at the Battle of Catraeth around 600 AD. Similarly, the Battle of Gwent Estrad is attributed to Taliesin, traditionally thought to be a bard at the court of Reged in roughly the same period. There are religious works in Gaelic including the Elegy for St. Columba by Darlan for Gael, c. 597, and In Praise of St. Columba by Began MacLuigdech of Rum, c. 677. In Latin they include a Prayer for Protection, c. mid-6th century, and Altis Prosata, c. 597. What is arguably the most important medieval work written in Scotland, the Vita Columbae, by Adomnan, Abbot of Iona, was also written in Latin. The next most important piece of Scottish hagiography, the verse Life of Saint Ninian, was written in Latin in Whithorn in the 8th century. In Old English there is the Dream of the Rood, from which lines are found on the Ruthwell Cross, making it the only surviving fragment of Northumbrian Old English from early medieval Scotland. It has also been suggested on the basis of ornithological references that the poem The Seafarer was composed somewhere near the base rock in East Lothian. High Middle Ages beginning in the later 8th century. Viking raids and invasions may have forced a merger of the Gaelic and Pictish crowns that culminated in the rise of Syned Mac Alpin in the 840s, which brought to power the House of Alpin and the creation of the Kingdom of Alba. Historical sources, as well as place name evidence, indicate the ways in which the Pictish language in the north and Cumbric languages in the south were overlaid and replaced by Gaelic, Old English and later Norse. The Kingdom of Alba was overwhelmingly an oral society dominated by Gaelic culture. Our fuller sources for Wyland of the same period suggest that there would have been Fili, who acted as poets, musicians and historians, often attached to the court of a lord or king, and passed on the knowledge and culture in Gaelic to the next generation. For the 11th century, French, Flemish and particularly English became the main languages of Scottish burghs, most of which were located in the south and east, at least from the accession of David I, as part of a Davidian revolution that introduced French culture and political systems. Gaelic ceased to be the main language of the royal court and was probably replaced by French. After this de-Gaelicization of the Scottish court, a less highly regarded order of bards took over the functions of the Fili, and they would continue to act in a similar role in the Highlands and Islands into the 18th century. They often trained in bardic schools, of which a few, like the one run by the MacMurdoch dynasty, who were bards to the Lord of the Isles, existed in Scotland and a larger number in Ireland, until they were suppressed from the 17th century. Members of bardic schools were trained in the complex rules and forms of Gaelic poetry. Much of the work was never written down, and what survives was only recorded from the 16th century. It is possible that more Middle Irish literature was written in medieval Scotland than is often thought, but has not survived because the Gaelic literary establishment of eastern Scotland died out before the 14th century. Thomas Owen Clancy has argued argued that the Liber Brythonic, the so-called Irish Nennius, was written in Scotland, and probably at the monastery in Abernethy, but this text survives only from manuscripts preserved in Ireland. Other literary work that has survived includes that of the prolific poet Giles Bride Albanic. About 1218, Giles Bride wrote a poem, heading for Damietta, on his experiences of the Fifth Crusade. In the 13th century, French flourished as a literary language, and produced the Roman de Fergus, the earliest piece of non-Celtic vernacular literature to survive from Scotland. Many other stories in the Arthurian cycle, written in French and preserved only outside Scotland, are thought by some scholars, including D.D. Owen, to have been written in Scotland. There is some Norse literature from areas of Scandinavian settlement, such as the Northern Isles and the Western Isles. The famous Orkneyinga saga, however, although it pertains to the earldom of Orkney, was written in Iceland. In addition to French, Latin too was a literary language, with works that include the Carmen de Morte su Melody, a poem which exalts triumphantly the victory of the citizens of Glasgow over Somer mac Gilla Brigte, and the Inchcombe Antiphona, a hymn in praise of Saint Columba. Late Middle Ages. In the late Middle Ages, Middle Scots, often simply called English, became the dominant language of the country. It was derived largely from Old English, with the addition of elements from Gaelic and French. Although resembling the language spoken in northern England, it became a distinct dialect from the late 14th century onwards. It began to be adopted by the ruling elite as they gradually abandoned French. By the 15th century it was the language of government, with Acts of Parliament, council records and treasurers' accounts almost all using it from the reign of James I onwards. As a result, Gaelic, once dominant north of the River Tay, began a steady decline. Lowland writers began to treat Gaelic as a second-class, rustic and even amusing language, helping to frame attitudes towards the Highlands and to create a cultural gulf with the Lowlands. The first surviving major text in Scots literature is John Barbers' Bruce, composed under the patronage of Robert II and telling the story in epic poetry of Robert I's actions before the English invasion till the end of the War of Independence. The work was extremely popular among the Scots-speaking aristocracy, and Barber is referred to as the father of Scots poetry, holding a similar place to his contemporary Chaucer in England. In the early 15th century these were followed by Andrew of Wintoun's verse originale Chronicle of Scotland and Blind Harry's The Wallace, which blended historical romance with the verse chronicle. They were probably influenced by Scott versions of popular French romances that were also produced in the period, including the Buick of Alexander, Launcelot o' the Lake and the Porteous of Noblena by Gilbert Hay. Much Middle Scots literature was produced by Macas, poets with links to the royal court, which included James I. Many of the Macas had university education and so were also connected with the Kirk. However, Dunbar's Lament for the Macquaries provides evidence of a wider tradition of secular writing outside of court and kirk, now largely lost. Before the advent of printing in Scotland, writers such as Robert Henryson, William Dunbar, Walter Kennedy and Gavin Douglas have been seen as leading a golden age in Scottish poetry. In the late 15th century, Scots prose also began to develop as a genre. Although there are earlier fragments of original Scots prose, such as the Affleck Chronicle, the first complete surviving work includes John Ireland's The Mirror of Wisdom. There were also prose translations of French books of chivalry that survived survive from the 1450s, including the Book of the Law of Armies and the Order of Nietzsche and the treatise Secreta Secretorum, an Arabic work believed to be Aristotle's advice to Alexander the Great. The establishment of a printing press under royal patent in 1507 would begin to make it easier to disseminate Scottish literature and was probably aimed at bolstering Scottish national identity. The first Scottish press was established in Southgate in Edinburgh by the merchant Walter Chapman and the bookseller Andrew Meyer, although the first press was relatively short-lived. Beside law codes and religious works, the press also produced editions of the work of Scottish makers before its demise, probably about 1510. The next recorded press was that of Thomas Davidson, the first in a long line of King's printers, who also produced editions of works of the makers. The landmark work in the reign of James IV was Gavin Douglas's version of Virgil's Aeneid, the Enneados, which was the first complete translation of a major classical text in an Anglic language, finished in 1513, but overshadowed by the disaster at Flodden. Early modern era, 16th century. As a patron of poets and authors, James V supported William Stewart and John Bellenden, who translated the Latin history of Scotland compiled in 1527 by Hector Boyce into verse and prose. David Lindsay, diplomat and the head of the Leon court, was a prolific poet. He wrote elegiac narratives, romances and satires. George Buchanan had a major influence as a Latin poet, founding a tradition of Neo-Latin poetry that would continue into the 17th century. Contributors to this tradition included Royal Secretary John Maitland, Reformer Andrew Melville, John Johnston and David Hume of Godscroft. For the 1550s, in the reign of Mary, Queen of Scots, and the minority of her son James VI, cultural pursuits were limited by the lack of a royal court and by political turmoil. The Kirk, heavily influenced by Calvinism, also discouraged poetry that was not devotional in nature. Nevertheless, poets from this period included Richard Maitland of Leathington, who produced meditative and satirical verses in the style of Dunbar, John Rowland, who read allegorical satires in the tradition of Douglas, and courtier and minister Alexander Hume, whose corpus of work includes nature poetry and epistolary verse. Alexander Scott's use of short verse designed to be sung to music opened the way for the Castilian poets of James VI's adult reign. In the 1580s and 1590s, James VI strongly promoted the literature of the country of his birth in Scots. His treatise, Some Rules and Cautions to be Observed and Eschewed in Scottish Prosody, published in 1584 when he was aged 18, was both a poetic manual and a description of the poetic tradition in his mother tongue, to which he applied Renaissance principles. He became patron and member of a loose circle of Scottish Jacobean court poets and musicians, later called the Castilian Band, which included William Fowler, John Stewart of Baldinis, and Alexander Montgomery. They translated key Renaissance texts and produced poems using French forms, including sonnets and short sonnets for narrative, nature description, satire and meditations on love. Later poets that followed in this vein included William Alexander, Alexander Craig and Robert Ayton. By the late 1590s, the king's championing of his native Scottish tradition was to some extent diffused by the prospect of inheriting of the English throne. Lindsay produced an interlude on Lithgow Palace for the king and queen, thought to be a version of his play The Three Estates in 1540, which satirized the corruption of church and state, and which is the only complete play to survive from before the Reformation. Buchanan phenomenon was major influence on continental theatre, with plays such as Jefferts and Baptistes, which influenced Pierre Corneille and Jean Racine and through them the neoclassical tradition in French drama. But his impact in Scotland was limited by his choice of Latin as a medium. The anonymous, the manner of the Syring of An play and Philetus are isolated examples of surviving plays. The latter is a vernacular Scots comedy of errors, probably designed for court performance for Mary, Queen of Scots, or James VI. The same system of professional companies of players and theatres that developed in England in this period was absent in Scotland. But James VI signalled his interest in drama by arranging for a company of English players to erect a playhouse and perform in 1599. 17th century, having extolled the virtues of Scots poesy, following his accession to the English throne, James VI increasingly favoured the language of southern England. In 1611 the Kirk adopted the English Authorised King James Version of the Bible. In 1617 interpreters were declared no longer necessary in the Port of London because Scots and Englishmen were now not so far different botane. Understandeth in Euther. Jenny Wormold describes James as creating a three-tier system, with Gaelic at the bottom and English at the top. The loss of the court as a centre of patronage in 1603 was a major blow to Scottish literature. A number of Scottish poets, including William Alexander, John Murray and Robert.It, accompanied the king to London, where they continued to write, but they soon began to anglicise the written language. James's characteristic role as active literary participant and patron in the English court made him a defining figure for English Renaissance poetry and drama, which would reach a pinnacle of achievement in his reign. But his patronage for the high style in his own Scottish tradition largely became sidelined. The only significant court poet to continue to work in Scotland after the king's departure was William Drummond of Hawthornden. As the tradition of classical Gaelic poetry declined, a new tradition of vernacular Gaelic poetry began to emerge. While classical poetry used a language largely fixed in the 12th century, the vernacular continued to develop. In contrast to the classical tradition, which used syllabic meter, vernacular poets tended to use stressed meter. However, they shared with the classic poets a set of complex metaphors and role, as the verse was still often panegyric. A number of these vernacular poets were women, such as Mary MacLeod of Harris. The tradition of Neo-Latin poetry reached its fruition with the publication of the anthology of the Delicia Poetrum Scotorum, published in Amsterdam by Arthur Johnston and Sir John Scott of Scots.The, and containing work by the major Scottish practitioners since Buchanan. This period was marked by the work of the first-named female Scottish poets. Elizabeth Melville's Ain't Godly Dream was a popular religious allegory and the first book published by a woman in Scotland. Anna Hume, daughter of David Hume of Godscroft, adapted Petrarch's Triumphs of Love, Chastity, Death. This was the period when the ballad emerged as a significant written form in Scotland. Some ballads may date back to the late medieval era and deal with events and people that can be traced back as far as the 13th century, including Sir Patrick Spens and Thomas the Rhymer, but which are not known to have existed until the 18th century. They were probably composed and transmitted orally and only began to be written down and printed, often as broadsides and as part of chapbooks, later being recorded and noted in books by collectors including Robert Burns and Walter Scott. For the 17th century they were used as a literary form by aristocratic authors including Robert Semple, Lady Elizabeth Wardlaw and Lady Grizzel Bailey. The loss of a royal court also meant there was no force to counter the Kirk's dislike of theatre, which struggled to survive in Scotland. However, it was not entirely extinguished. The Kirk used theatre for its own purposes in schools and was slow to suppress popular folk dramas. Surviving plays for the period include William Alexander's monarchic tragedies, written just before his departure with the king for England in 1603. They were closet dramas, designed to be read rather than performed, and already indicate Alexander's preference for Southern English over the Scots language. There were some attempts to revive Scottish drama. In 1663, Edinburgh lawyer William Clark read Marciano of the Discovery, a play about the restoration of a legitimate dynasty in Florence after many years of civil war. It was performed at the Tennis Court Theatre at Holyrood Palace before the Parliamentary High Commissioner John Leslie, Earl of Rothes. Thomas Sidsurf's Daruga's Wiles of the Coffee House was first performed in London in 1667 and then in Edinburgh the year after, and drew on Spanish comedy. A relative of Sidsurf, physician Archibald Pitcairn, wrote the Assembly a Scotch Reformation, a ribald satire on the morals of the Presbyterian Kirk, circulating in manuscript, but not published until 1722, helping to secure the association between Jacobitism and professional drama that discouraged the creation of professional theatre.